There are two answers that people usually give to this question. Answer 1. Hang on. It's the 9th of April. Answer 2. Easter falls on the first Sunday after the first full moon on or after the spring equinox. This answer is wrong, and not just because if you live in the southern hemisphere, Easter happens in the autumn. If you'd followed this formula in 2019, for instance, you would have ended up celebrating Easter a month before everyone else. What's going on? Why doesn't this formula work, and when is Easter actually? The real answer to this is complicated and involves a lot of maths and a lot of history. The maths is more in my wheelhouse, so I'll start there. Let's say you want to make a calendar. Most likely you'll want to base it around some kind of astronomical cycle, and there are two obvious candidates, the seasons or the phases of the moon. A calendar based on the seasons is called a solar calendar because it's based on the solar year, i.e. one revolution of the Earth around the Sun. You're probably more familiar with this kind because it includes the Gregorian calendar, which most of the world uses. On the other hand, a lunar calendar runs on cycles of one lunar month, corresponding to one revolution of the moon around the Earth. There are a couple of reasons why you might prefer a lunar calendar. For instance, a 30-day cycle is much easier to keep track of than a 365-day cycle. Also, you can tell your position in a lunar cycle to a pretty good level of precision just by looking at the sky, whereas determining your exact position in a solar cycle requires specialist equipment. Of course, a major downside of the lunar calendar is that it no longer keeps track of the seasons, which is quite a useful thing for a calendar to do. These two astronomical cycles, the Earth moving around the Sun and the Moon moving around the Earth, don't have anything to do with each other, and they're not in sync. That means that any straightforward lunar calendar is going to drift from the seasons extremely quickly. One lunar month is about 29.53 days, so a year consisting of 12 of these months would be 11 days too short compared to a solar year, and a year of 13 months would be 19 days too long. The question then might become, can we make a calendar that keeps in sync with both the lunar months and the solar years? And the answer is yes, we can. In fact, we can solve this problem by first thinking about a much more familiar one, leap years. A solar year may not be a whole number of months, but it definitely isn't a whole number of days either. A calendar year of exactly 365 days would be about 6 hours too short, which would be enough to cause substantial drift over relatively short time periods. We fix this problem by adding in leap days, extra days that get slotted into the calendar only in certain years, so that the year length averages out to be what it should be. We used to use the Julian calendar to do this, which added one leap day every 4 years. This was okay, but not perfect, so in the 16th century-ish, we switched to the Gregorian calendar, which adds 97 leap days every 400 years. This ends up being very, very close to the true length of a solar year, close enough that we've kept on using it ever since with almost no problems. We can use a similar principle for lunar calendars to keep them in sync with the seasons, only instead of adding leap days, we add entire leap months. The most common approach for this is something called the Metonic cycle, named after Meton of Athens, which works like this. Most years have 12 months, which alternate between being 29 and 30 days long. However, 7 out of every 19 years also contain an extra month, which again is 30 days long. You might ask, how do you choose which 7 years are the long ones? The answer is, essentially, it's arbitrary. In the long term, the maths works out the same whichever way you do it, but the Babylonian and Hebrew calendars, which both used this system, picked these years in each cycle as the ones with 13 months. One of these 19-year cycles is called a Metonic cycle, and it just so happens to be very close to a whole number of lunar months and a whole number of solar years, which means the long-term drift is very small. The result is a calendar that syncs up reasonably well with both the moon and the sun, which we call a lunisolar calendar. Now, as previously mentioned, this system, or at least a slight variation on it, is used as the Hebrew calendar, on which all Jewish festivals are scheduled. Easter, of course, is not a Jewish festival, it's a Christian one, but the Hebrew calendar is still important for reasons that will become obvious. The date of Easter is based on the date of the resurrection of Jesus according to the Bible, which is believed to have taken place on the Sunday after Passover. Passover happens on the 15th of Nisan, which is the first month of the year in the Hebrew calendar, and each Hebrew month begins with a new moon. The question then becomes, when exactly does Nisan start? Well, this is where things get difficult because, as discussed previously, the date of the new year moves around relative to the Gregorian calendar. The best we can really do is say that it happens around spring, but anything more specific than that depends on the exact year. Except, although the modern Hebrew calendar runs on a strict 19-year Metonic cycle, it didn't always work like this. Until sometime around the 3rd to 6th centuries, leap months were not added based on a predetermined cycle. They were added essentially on an ad hoc basis depending on certain criteria. The main one of these criteria was, is the barley ripe yet, which served as a pretty good approximate indicator of whether or not the spring equinox had passed. And since the entirety of the New Testament takes place before the 3rd century, the date calculation would have originally been based on this system, not on the strict Metonic one. So you can maybe see where the conventional formula would have come from. We're defining Easter as the Sunday after Passover, which is 15 days after the first new moon of spring, and obviously 15 days after a new moon is roughly a full moon, so that would settle it, right? No, because remember, the month of Nisan in the pre-Metonic Hebrew calendar doesn't start after the equinox, it starts around the equinox, because the ripeness of barley is not a precise astronomical measurement. Theoretically speaking, the 15th of Nisan, and thus Easter, could fall before the equinox, which would make this calculation wrong. Enter the First Council of Nicaea, a meeting of Christian clergymen in 325 AD, at which many different things were discussed, including the date of Easter. Most Christians were using the Julian calendar at this point, and there was a broadly echoed sentiment that the Church should stop relying on the Hebrew one. Partly this was because people were arguing, hey, this calendar is a colossal mess. They're just haphazardly inserting months at random. What kind of a system is that? They keep putting Passover before the equinox. Passover isn't meant to be before the equinox. We can't keep relying on this to figure out when to celebrate Easter. This is madness. This perceived complexity is the most politely cited reason for the move away from the Jewish calendar. However, the change was also linked to wider anti-Semitism that was very much prevalent in Christian thought at the time, and which did not make any attempt to hide itself. And so the First Council of Nicaea designed their own system, a single, unambiguous calculation that they could do without having to consult the Jewish community every year. Just kidding. Most of the people present, although by no means all, agreed that there should be some sort of calculation independent of the Hebrew calendar, but they never actually set in stone what precisely that calculation should be. This led to many different systems which all conflicted slightly with each other in subtle ways, and I'm not going to go through them all because I don't want this video to be an hour long, but the one that eventually won out was a version of this formula. Logic here was that Easter should fall on the Sunday after Passover, and Passover should fall on the first full moon of spring, and spring should start on the equinox. Except, I said a version of this formula rather than this formula because there are two small lies in here. Equinox doesn't really mean equinox, and full moon doesn't really mean full moon. So what do they mean? Let's start with the equinox. The astronomical definition of equinox is the moment when the Earth's axis of rotation is directly perpendicular to the line between the Sun and the Earth. By contrast, the Christian ecclesiastical definition of equinox is the 21st of March. Why is this? Well, the answer to that goes all the way back to the Julian calendar. When the Julian calendar was adopted in 45 BC, it was set so that the equinox would fall on the 25th of March. But the Julian calendar isn't very good. It has too many leap days, so it drifts from the seasons by about one day every 128 years. By the time the First Council of Nicaea met in the 4th century, it had got about 4 days out of sync. At this point, the Church got fed up and decided to stop recomputing the equinox date every century and just set the official date to the 21st, where it was now in perpetuity, even as the true astronomical date drifted further and further back. Eventually, in 1582, we adopted the Gregorian calendar, which does a much better job at staying in sync over long periods. The trouble was that by this point the astronomical equinox had shifted all the way back to the 11th of March, so when the calendar was adopted, 10 days got skipped because Pope Gregory wanted to bring the astronomical equinox back in line with the ecclesiastical one. And today, the 21st of March remains the observed date of the equinox, even though nowadays the real one usually falls on the 20th instead, because the Gregorian calendar is not perfect either. It's also why some Eastern Orthodox Christians who still use the Julian calendar for religious purposes often celebrate Easter on a different day to everyone else, even though none of these things look like they should depend on your choice of calendar. These folks are working based on their observed equinox, which is the date that they call the 21st of March, which nowadays is about 2 weeks later than the date that everyone else calls the 21st of March. So that's one lie. The other is the full moon, which again is based on predictable ecclesiastical rules rather than actual astronomical observations. This involves something called the Paschal full moon tables, which are very nuanced and complicated to explain in full, but at a high level what they do is essentially rederive the 19-year Metonic cycle, and then add in some minor corrections every century or so to account for the drift. This keeps the observed full moons extremely close to the astronomical ones over long periods of time, enough that they shouldn't ever be out of sync by more than a day or so. So with all that in mind, we can now ask, what happened in 2019? Well, going by astronomical observations, the equinox fell on the 20th of March, and the full moon fell on either the 20th or the 21st, depending on your exact location on the Earth. The 20th of March was a Wednesday, so Easter should have fallen on Sunday the 24th. The ecclesiastical system, on the other hand, put the equinox on the 21st, as it has done every year since the 4th century, but it put the corresponding full moon strictly on the 20th. That meant we had to wait another month for the next full moon to roll around before Easter could happen. That full moon, according to the tables, happened on Saturday the 20th of April, so the official date of Easter was Sunday the 21st, unless you observe the Julian calendar, in which case it happened a week later on the 15th. I think it's worth taking a moment to consider all the moving parts here, both literally and figuratively. An object rotating in free space is one of the simplest physical phenomena you could imagine, and yet the combination of just 3 of these rotational cycles, the Earth around its axis, the Moon around the Earth, and the Earth around the Sun, leads to a huge collection of different timekeeping systems, and the date of Easter tells a story of how these systems interact and interweave with each other. Ultimately, every calendar that humans make is an attempt to synchronize the incoherent, to make rational approximations of irrational measurements, and the way we've chosen to do that is not the only way we might have chosen. But of course there is a simpler answer to all of this. This year, barring any sudden drastic shift in ecclesiastical policy, Easter will happen on the 9th of April.